So far, we have seen how to add transitions and animations with CSS, but in the next lectures, we'll see how we can do the same with JavaScript. Using JavaScript for this provides the maximum degree of flexibility and can be used in scenarios where CSS is not sufficient. And you can in fact use a combination of JavaScript and CSS if you prefer. The way this works is that when transitioning an element, Vue emits a number of events which you can then hook into. We will do this by using the vOn directive on the transition component. So just to give you an idea of which hooks are available, I'll just copy them in right here, just to avoid having to type them out. And the first one is the before enter hook, which is triggered just before the transition enters. And the enter one is actually where you will add the actual transition. And afterwards the after enter hook is invoked. So this is pretty similar to the CSS classes that we saw earlier. Anyways, I won't dive into these too much now, because first of all they are pretty self-explanatory, and secondly you will see them in action in just a moment. These hooks are all passed the transitioning element as their first argument, which is a native HTML element. The enter and leave hooks, however, have an additional argument passed to them, namely a done argument. This argument is a callback function, which should be invoked whenever the transition finishes. With CSS transitions, Vue could sniff the CSS to find out when a transition ended, but this is not really possible with JavaScript code. But why is this even necessary? Because wouldn't it be reasonable to just assume that the transition is finished whenever the function finishes executing? In some cases it might, but this won't work if we have any asynchronous code within our hook function. In this case, we just have to invoke the done function whenever the transition finishes, regardless of whether or not the code is asynchronous. If the transition is only implemented with JavaScript, then you must invoke this function. Okay, so now it's time to see how we can actually use these hooks for implementing a transition. Let's implement the fade transition that we saw before. For this, we need to use the before enter and enter hooks. So let's begin by adding methods for these hooks. So let's add a methods object to the component and add a before enter method, taking the elements as its first argument, and an enter method, which takes the transitioning elements as well as the first argument, and the done callback as the second one. And of course, I have to enter the names of these methods within the template, and I will also clear out the hooks that we don't need to use for now. So for now, I'm only interested in the before enter and enter hooks. So let's enter before enter here and enter for the enter hook. Within the before enter hook, I will just set the opacity of the element to 0 because we want to increase the opacity gradually from here. So remember that this is what we did with the vEnter CSS class earlier. So within this hook I can access the elements by using the EL parameter, and this is a native DOM element, so I can access the style on this element. And then I can just set the opacity property to 0. And now let's go down to the enter hook and implement the actual transition. And because I'll be manipulating the opacity, I will set a variable with this to 0 initially, and I'll be changing this in some code now. And now I want to run some code within a setInterval function. So I'll add a callback arrow function here, and this should be invoked every 100 milliseconds. And every 100 milliseconds I want to increase the opacity by 0.1. And since eventually I'll need to stop increasing the opacity and therefore stop the transition, I need to check if the opacity is greater than 0.9. In that case, I want to stop the transition because in that case it's done. I will invoke the done function. But actually I need to do one more thing, because I need to stop this interval function from being invoked. So I will store this interval within a constant, like that. And this lets me use it with the clear interval function. like this. So this will stop the callback from being invoked further. Okay, so the last thing we need is to actually change the element's opacity. For this, I can use the EL parameter. Again, access the style.opacity and set it equal to the opacity variable. And let's open up a browser and see if it works. So let's click the button. And it works, so that's awesome. There's no fade out animation though. I won't implement this now because it's really just the opposite of what we just did. But that could be a good exercise for you if you want to practice a bit. That's it. That's how easy it is to transition elements with JavaScript. Of course, you could do all sorts of transitions or animations within these hooks. So this was just a simple example of what you can do. Since implementing transitions and animations with JavaScript is quite tedious, you might consider using a library for this, such as velocity.js.